Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session Une identité, nordique, construite ou delà les frontières de la village artiste de Grez-sur-Loing. I'm going to present you the speakers and presenters, and going to start with the first presenter, Karin Sidén, associate professor at the Uppsala University for Art History, author and currently the director of the Prins Eugens Waldemarsudde. She worked as a curator for the Swedish National Museum and subsequently as a research director. She published numerous works including on salon painting, plan art painting, as well as symbolism and decadence. Her work often reflects the national identity and, among other things, she deals with the context of classical art as an expression of historical art which was contemporary at the past. According to her, it can be an expression of universal feelings and thoughts, inspires reflection and processes timeless qualities. She understands the question posed to art as universal and at its core sometimes as existentialistic. The next presenter is going to be Vibeke Röstorp, art historian, author, critic and curator. She examines in her work the Scandinavian and French art of the 19th and 20th centuries. She places a special focus on national similarities in the context of bilateral art history. Her dissertation, Le mythe du retour, is about the Scandinavian artist who came to France at the turn of the century, and examines the effects at the moment of their returning. The focus is on the schools that were influenced by the homecoming artists and developed a national romanticism, which distorted the nature of Scandinavian art. Further works by Röstorp can be found, among others, in the publication Anders Zorn, in which she co-authored. And last but not least, Alexandra Herlitz, lecturer at the University of Gothenburg, examines, among other things, Scandinavian art from the 19th century, critical historiography, sociological of art, national identity, art historical relations on a transnational level, and artist colonies. Transnational interactions also played a major role in her last work, Gränskoloniens sociala Netzwerk, which appeared this year in the publication Grez-sur-Loing, Kunst och relationer by Prins Eugens Waldemarsudde. Further publications can be found in numerous works and journals such as the Museum Management and Curatorship, the Journal of Art History, or the Art in Translation. In her doctoral thesis sur Grez-sur-Loing, she deals with the artistic colony in terms of its art and internationally, as well as sociological aspects. Thank you very much, and we go.
So thank you very much for this kind introduction. Of course, I'm very grateful and honored to see all of you here this afternoon, and especially a warm thank to all of my friends and colleagues from Grez-sur-Loing, and of course from Sweden and elsewhere. Let me start this session with a presentation about our ongoing exhibition on Grez-sur-Loing, Art and Relations. That's the title of our exhibition. And it is a research-based exhibition at Prins Eugens Waldemarsudde in Stockholm, as we just have heard. Concerning the context of our exhibition, it is shown, this exhibition, at Prins Eugens Waldemarsudde, and that is one of the most visited art museums in Sweden today. It used to be the former home of the hereditary Prince Eugen, the Prince of Sweden and Norway. He was the fourth and youngest son of King Oscar II and Queen Sophia of Nassau. She was from Germany from the beginning. Anyway, Prince Eugen became one of the most important landscape painters in the 1890s in Sweden. He was a great art collector. He was a key figure and a central figure in the Swedish art world for many years, between around 1890 up until his death in 1947. And just a short information about the fact that Prince Eugen was really very much influenced by French art. And he studied in Paris for Puvis de Chavannes, Léon Bonnat, Henri Gervais, and Alfred Roll in Paris between 1887 and 1889. But let me now, after this short presentation of our museum, start to talk about this fantastic artist colony, the international artist colony in Grez-sur-Loing. Well, Grez-sur-Loing, a village located about 60 kilometers southeast of Paris and not very far from Fontainebleau, this is a legendary village in Swedish art history. It was there that a number of young artists, many of whom were later going to make the mark on the Swedish art scene, gathered in the early 1880s and became part of the international artist colony that had existed there since the 1870s. This spring, the art museum Prins Eugens Waldemarsudde in Stockholm has arranged a widely acclaimed research-based exhibition, the first in Sweden as well as in Europe, to present the artist colony in Grez-sur-Loing in an international context. In our exhibition, and you can see a view from the first gallery room here, in our exhibition that opened in the middle of February this year, the Grez-sur-Loing colony is for the first time ever presented in an exhibition, mainly as an artist colony with Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon artists, writers and musicians, where many relationships and connections were forged between artists of different nationalities. The exhibition that is shown in 5 rooms in the museum's gallery wing from 1913 features more than 100 works by famous and lesser-known names of 8 nationalities. Artists such as Swedes Oskar Törnå, Carl Larsson, Karin Larsson Nebergö, Julia Bäck, Emma Löfstedt Chadwick, Hugo Birger, Carl Nordström, Ivar Nyberg, Gottfrid Kallstenius, Carolina Benedicts married Bruce, Gerda Rosvall Kallstenius, Anselm Schultzberg and Elias Ertman, but also the Norwegian painters Christian Krog and Christian Skredsvig, Danish painter Peder Severin Krøyer, and the Irish painters Frank O'Meara and Catherine McCausland, the American Francis Brooks Chadwick, and William Blair Bruce from Canada. And you will see in the presentation with the images that in all of the exhibition rooms there are presented Scandinavian paintings or paintings by Scandinavian artists next to paintings by Anglo-Saxon artists. For instance, in this image, you can see in the middle a painting by William Blair Bruce of Carolina Benedicts Bruce, sitting, working with an engraving. It's called the Plein Air Studio. And next to that, it's a painting by Julia Bäck to the left. And it's a painting by Christian Krog, the Norwegian painter, next to that one. And in the opposite direction, you can see, for instance, a painting by Frank O'Meara. All of these artists, they visited Grez-sur-Loing, and they became, as I mentioned before, a part of an international artist colony. Well, our exhibition is part of the Prins Eugens Waldemarsudde multi-annual effort to highlight and investigate European artist colonies of the 19th century as phenomena on the art scene. Previous exhibitions have included Scandinavia's most famous artist colony at Skagen in northern Jutland, Denmark in 2013, and the artist colony at Tyresö outside Stockholm in 2014, where Prins Eugen, the founder and donor of our art museum, was a central character. And in the autumn of 2018, we arranged an exhibition on the Worpswede colony outside Bremen in northern Germany. And the latter, the Worpswede exhibition, was the first exhibition ever in Scandinavia presenting paintings by the interesting German artists in the village of Worpswede, with famous names such as Paula Mårtensson-Becker, Otto Mårtensson, Heinrich Vogler, and Ottilie Reilander, to mention a few of them. But unlike the aforementioned artist colonies, in which indigenous artists were in majority, Grez-sur-Loing was a predominantly international colony. In Grez, artists from England, Ireland, Scotland, the US, and Canada, as well as painters from Sweden and Norway, dominated. Some German, Italian, Danish, Finnish, Spanish, and some, not very many, but some French painters as well. And from 1889, Japanese artists too found their way to Grez. Well, situated close to the rapidly growing metropolis Paris, this idyllic French village by the forest of Fontainebleau functioned during the summer as an informal platform for creative interaction and social contacts across national borders. During the productive artistic summers in Grez, the artists devoted most of their time to plein air and valeur painting and began to experiment with increasingly bold compositions, radical framing, and impressionistic renderings of the fluctuations of light across the beautiful landscape. And here you can see an image from the opposite side of the wall in the room, the first gallery room, with some paintings by, for instance, in the middle, concerning an interesting radical composition, a painting by Carl Nordström, The Old Bridge in Grez-sur-Loing, and next to that, a Japanese inspired painting by Karin Larsson, born Bergö, and many other paintings, of course, of interests. Well, most of the artists in the colony were quite young when they came to Grez. They traveled there from their home countries, often via Paris, and studies at some of the Académies Libres, such as Académie Julian or Académie Colarossi, or from villages such as Barbizon, Fontainebleau, Marlotte, Nemours, and Montigny, to mention some of the villages that were frequented by artists and were geographically close to Grez. Many of the artists then traveled to and from the capital's rich art scene and exhibitions in the winter, especially at the Salon, and Grez, with its opportunities for outdoor painting and socializing with like-minded people in the summer. Socially, Grez worked as a platform for artist communities, but also for friendships and love relationships. That's important too, within and across national borders. And there are some interesting examples. This is a view, an image from our main gallery room, and concerning relationships, famous examples is, for instance, Karin and Carl Larsson. They met well, before in Stockholm, but they fell in love in Grez-sur-Loing. It's very romantic. It is said that they even not only fell in love there, but afterwards they married, actually, as a result of the visit in Grez. And in the center, in the background of this image, you can see a painting. Well, it's not very easy to see it, but anyway, it's a painting by Carl Larsson, where you can see Karin Bergö and also their firstborn child, little Susanne, that was born in Grez-sur-Loing. And to the left, you can see a painting by Carolina, or it's a painting by William Blair Bruce of his wife Carolina Benedicts Bruce, the sculptor. And the painting's title is Femme Sculpteur, and next to it, it's some very interesting original plaster cast sculptures by Carolina Benedicts, the Swedish sculptor, and they also met and fell in love in Grez-sur-Loing. Anyway, other couples were Carl and Tekla Nordström, but also the Swedish painter Emma Löfstedt and the American painter Francis Brooks Chadwick, and as I mentioned before here, the Swedish sculptor Carolina Benedicts and the Canadian William Blair Bruce. They all met in Grez. Well, as for Carolina Benedicts, she came from an upper-class family in Sweden. In 1881, she was only the third female student of sculpture to be accepted at the Royal Academy in Stockholm. In 1885, she met in Grez her future husband, William Blair Bruce from Canada. And Benedicts created her most prominent works while living in Grez, including, as you can see here, the yawner to the left, the sculpture to the left, and the wounded bather to the right that were also shown at the Salon in Paris. She was strongly influenced by the realistic style of Auguste Rodin and shared his interests in physicality and distinctive characters. In several of their works, Benedicts and Blair Bruce expressed their mutual inspiration and admiration, and you can see that expressed, of course, in this impressive portrait by Blair Bruce of Carolina Benedicts Bruce. It's really a portrait of that shows great respect in many ways. Well, the artist couple lived in Grez between 1889 and 1894 in the so-called Pink Pavilion at Hotel Chevillon, where Carl and Karin Larsson had lived as newlyweds. In 1900, the couple began creating their artist home on the island Gotland in the Baltic Sea, called Brusebo, which is now a museum. So that's worth a visit as well, if you have some spare time. Well, despite the transnational links, the Grez-sur-Loing colony has to date mainly been described as a domestic affair in Swedish art history publication, as well as in exhibitions. This view was spread by some of the Swedish artists who worked in Grez, as well as by Swedish art critics who reported home from the village, as well as by several contemporary art historians. These depictions of Grez-sur-Loing, which have been subsequently repeated in an often uncritical way, are mainly expressions of the nationalist currents that influenced Swedish arts, art politics, and art history around the turn of the century 1900. The latest research on the Grez colony, as well as standard works on artist colonies in Europe during the period around 1870 to 1910, by, among others, Nina Lubren and Mikael Jacobs, paint a completely different picture of how artists from different countries lived and worked side by side in Grez. One of the art historians who has analyzed the Grez colony from an international as well as an art sociological and reception history perspective is today's speaker, Alexandra Herlitz. We will hear more interesting things from her later on today. And her acclaimed dissertation, Grez-sur-Loing Revisited, the International Artist Colony in a Different Light, published in 2013, has been of great importance for the Waldemarsudde exhibition and catalogue. Our extensive exhibition is accompanied by a catalogue with contributions from writers in England, Ireland, the US, Norway, and Sweden, who have all submitted articles based on the latest research on the Grez-sur-Loing as an artist colony. I will say a couple of words about this catalogue. As you can see the catalogue as a parallel to the exhibition, because the same topics that is presented in the exhibition is also, they are also presented in this exhibition catalogue. Unfortunately, it's in Swedish, but with an English summary. Well, it starts this catalogue with an article written by me as associate professor, yes, in art history, and one of the curators of the exhibition. It's an overall introductory article about the colony in Grez and about its Swedish artists, entitled Grez-sur-Loing, Locality, Artworks, Originators. Next comes an article by Alexandra Herlitz on the social network of the Grez colony, where she describes the reception in older art history writings of the Grez colony, for instance, but she also looks at the colony in relationships and the relationships between the artists and the local population, and of course the Grez colony in connection with other art colonies of the time. The Norwegian painters in Grez are devoted a special article by senior lecturer Eugens. And the Norwegians, that can be good to know, were the first of the Scandinavians to go to Grez. The first visits took place around 1880, and although only a few Norwegian artists painted at Grez, those who did include important names such as Erik Werenskjold, Christian Skredsvig and Christian Krog, who worked on several important works there. A special case study entitled The Artist Couple Carolina Benedicts-Bruce and William Blair Bruce in Grez-sur-Loing has been written by Johanna Pietikainen, and she's a former curator at Brusebo. Benedicts and Blair Bruce are one of the transnational couples that are focused, especially in the exhibition and in the catalogue. The Waldemarsudde curator, PhD student Karin has, as one of the exhibition curators, contributed 2 articles to the catalogue. One is about artists in dialogue, Richard Berg's portrait of Julia Beck and other friendship portraits. It looks at various portraits that the artists painted of one another in Grez and in Paris. It discusses the role of the portraitist and the act of portraying a fellow artist. In Rech's other article, The Art of Amusing Oneself, Festivities and Masquerades in Grez-sur-Loing, Festive Occasions in the Village receive a special analysis. Swedish artist Carl Larsson was instrumental in these festivities that involved singing, dancing, and the making of large-scale drawings in celebration of the occasion. The seldom described time in Grez after its heyday. I will give you some more pictures. This is from the 3rd room of the exhibition. Well, our archivist, Anna Meister, she's one of the curators of the exhibition as well. Her article, The End of an Era, The Last Swedish Grez Colonists, is an interesting topic, which shows that contrary to what has been stated in older art history publications, Swedish artists kept visiting Grez after 1886 and into the 1890s. The English-speaking artists in Grez are the topic of the PhD student Elizabeth Doe Stone's article called A Gay, Rollicking, Polyglot, Enthusiastic Band, Anglophone Encounters in Grez-sur-Loing. The Anglo-Saxon group initially colonized Grez from nearby Barbizon in 1876, and after the presence of Scandinavian artists had peaked in the early 1880s, they again made up the major foreign element in Grez. Well, in her article, Irish artist Frank O'Meara, a pioneer painter in the spirit of Grez, freelance researcher Mary Stratton Ryan devotes a special case study to the artist in which she writes about O'Meara's path to Grez and his early involvement in the colony and close ties to some of its Swedish members. English composer Frederick Delius, a very interesting composer, according to me, he settled in Grez in 1897, and he's in the focus of music historian Daniel Grimley's article, Village Strains, Delius in Grez. In the article, Grimley describes how the German-English composer came to make Grez his home and writes about the works he composed in the French village. Several authors of different nationalities also lived in Grez, something that we show in our exhibition. And they are also in focus in an article called Literary Grez by Björn Mejdal, Professor Emeritus. Robert Louis Stevenson and August Strindberg are the most famous of these authors, and their respective stays in Grez are described in some detail. Well, as I mentioned, the content of the research-based catalogue reflects the topics within the exhibition. In our exhibition, the thematical and aesthetic hanging of the artworks highlight themes such as Grez as a village for artistic inspiration, with repeated motifs such as the old bridge, streets, the gardens and environments of Grez and the river Loing, relationships within and across national borders among the artists depicted in their artworks, subjects of villages and the colony as a social platform for festivities and other gatherings. And concerning what I mentioned just before here, you can see some of the cartoons made by Carl Larsson from festivities in Grez-sur-Loing. Next to, you can say, a portrait gallery of some of the artists and musicians and so on that were active in Grez-sur-Loing in the artist colony. Well, except for investigating the artist colony in Grez as such and as an international platform for artistic inspiration in its heydays around 1875 to 85, our exhibition also shows that the colony did not end in the middle of the 1880s, as has been said before in Swedish art history publications. Both Swedish and Anglo-Saxon artists continued to visit Grez until the beginning of the 1890s. In the preparation of the exhibition, we worked very hard with the process of trying to get artworks for loan, not only from official museums, but also from private collections in Sweden, US, and from France. As for the latter, we were, for instance, able to trace, with help from Grez-sur-Loing, a couple of very interesting paintings by the Irish painter Frank O'Meara, who was a good friend of many Swedish painters. And we traced these paintings from a private owner just outside Grez-sur-Loing, paintings that have never before been shown for the public. We are, of course, extremely grateful for the help with that. Well, the exhibition will run until 8 August this year. It functions as a visual art form in its own right, but it also works as a manifestation of research and new knowledge in the exhibition media about Grez as an international artist colony. The exhibition also highlights, with Grez-sur-Loing as an example, the great importance of artist colonies as phenomena in the 19th century art world in Central and Northern Europe. And my last thing I would like to say is to welcome you, of course, all of you, to Stockholm and to the exhibition. You still have time to visit this exhibition. So if you come before the 18th of August, feel warmly welcome to Sweden's most beautiful art museum. So the next speaker is Alexandra Herlitz. So.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me at this festival. I will speak about the international artists colony in Grez during the period from 1875 to 85, when mainly Scandinavian and English-speaking artists were living and working in the French village Grez-sur-Loing. I will also raise the quite problematic Swedish historiography. The artist colony at Grez has been holding a significant place in Swedish art history. Many of the Swedish artists who later became the most renowned artists during the period of Swedish national romanticism around the turn of the last century have had important sojourns in Grez. What has been less known throughout the last century is that the Swedish artists in Grez did not only intermingle with Scandinavian artists, but as well with English-speaking nationalities. You have already heard about it. Art historians proceeded earlier on the assumption that there were 3 different colonies of international artists who lived and worked in Grez. The first wave of artists in the colony came from North America, Ireland, Scotland, England, and Canada from the 1870s on. From 1882 on, a wave of Scandinavian artists flooded the village Grez. And the third and last identified wave of artists that had haunted Grez from the 1890s on were of Japanese origin. These 3 waves may not be misconceived as the exclusive presence of certain nationalities in Grez. They should rather be seen as an expression of peaks of certain nationalities, which does not imply that no other nationalities were spending time in Grez simultaneously. In other words, Scandinavian artists were living and working in Grez simultaneously with other nationalities. However, in the Swedish art history of the colony in Grez, the Scandinavian contingent has been emphasized, where the rest of the polyglot group of artists in the colony has been more or less omitted. According to earlier Swedish art history, there appeared to have been no noteworthy contact between the Scandinavians and other foreign artists in the village. The latter appears to be peculiar, as there, as we already learned, are some examples of romance and matrimony between Swedish and English-speaking artists. The Swedish sculptress Carolina Benedicts married the Canadian painter William Blair Bruce, and the Swedish painter Emma Löfstedt married the American painter Francis Brooke Chadwick. Evidence like this suggests that the international artists in Grez intermingled despite linguistic groups. Swedish paintings from Grez have been characterized as having a Nordic character, which, for instance, the Swedish art historian Sixten Strömbom put into the following words in 1945. Cool, grey-toned in soft half-tones, born by rural freshness, this painting with a Nordic accent rendered the hazy Middle French idyll and Parisian plein air techniques. Also in later Swedish art historical texts on Grez, the paintings have been described as new Scandinavian art with a French flavor. In my research, I tracked down other international artists who were painting in Grez in the 1870s and 80s and examined their works of art. Interestingly, I could not detect a certain Nordic or Scandinavian trait in the Swedish paintings from Grez. The English-speaking artists in Grez seemed to paint similar motifs and applied similar tones, sentiment, and composition principles in their works as the Scandinavian painters. On the other hand, it is obvious that the international artists in Grez had common French inspirational examples, such as Jean-Charles Cazin, Léon Lermite, Jules Bastien Lepage, Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, and Henri Leroll. The motifs, the sentiment, and the delicate and dim tones of the French paintings are echoing in Swedish painting from Grez. In Swedish art history, the distinct dim and grey tone is inseparably linked with Grez and has been deemed characteristic for what has been called a Grez style. The grey tone that has been deployed in the paintings from Grez has earlier been declared as being a product of the local conditions in Grez, which thus were rendered in a naturalist manner by the painters. It was the artists themselves who suggested that the grey and dim setting in the paintings derived from, quote, the haze pervading the moisture-laden air and the consistently light colors of the scenery, end of quote, as the painter Georg Pauli put it. An earlier established notion in Swedish art history was that the Swedish painters abandoned that grey and dim tone in their art when they returned to Sweden, as this expression just didn't apply to Swedish climate and light conditions. These discussions excluded, of course, other paintings from Grez that actually were colorful, and bright. My research led to the conclusion that a so-called place myth about Grez has been established. A place myth is a typical feature in writings about artists' colonies that emphasizes and exaggerates a local, often natural, feature in the geographical place where an artist's colony has been established. Later written accounts can suggest that it was impossible for the artist to approach this landscape in any other way than the one that the colony now is famous for. However, a deeper investigation usually shows that these stylistic or thematic features have been developed over the course of several years and are not at all the product of an immediate experience of the local nature. This can also be stated concerning painting in Grez. Early paintings by the likes of Giuseppe Palizzi, Will Hickok-Lowe, or Theodore Robinson are not at all supporting the notion of Grez as a grey village. Their paintings show bright and saturated colors instead of the homogeneous overall grey tone that became popular in Grez in the end of the 1870s. In fact, the first group of Anglo-Saxon artists did not come to Grez for the grey dim that gave their paintings a melancholy tone, but because they wanted to have a river to swim in and to row. You can see the rowboats over there. A feature that Barbizon, where they spent time earlier, did not offer. A Swedish art history writing from the 20th century was so explicit that there had been no noteworthy contact between the Scandinavians and other nationalities in Grez. And as the paintings of the foreign artists in Grez in the 1880s turned out to be so similar, I wanted to find out if earlier Swedish art historians were correct in ruling out any international networking in Grez, and if not, for what reasons the notion of a straight Scandinavian community in Grez was established in Swedish art history. A quote by the famous Swedish writer and artist August Strindberg has often been adduced as a piece of evidence for the non-existing bonds between the Scandinavian and English-speaking artists in Grez. In an article, Strindberg wrote the following about the colony in Grez. Staying at the pension are Englishmen, Americans, Norwegians, and Swedes. The Americans' emancipation from a whole array of social constraints has created a free and easy tone, which offers repose to the weary. No one worries about what anyone else is doing. If the Scandinavians at their end of the table celebrate a name day with tinned spreads and a dram and sing for the first glass, the Americans may possibly listen to the singing, but will not give it another thought. And if an American chooses to eat raw tomatoes and drink brandy with his meal, and then rest his feet on a mantelpiece or a coat hanger, the Scandinavians will consider it none of their business. In this way, an excellent harmony is maintained, sometimes finding warmer expression in a shared after-dinner dance. Previous scholarship about artist colonies has shown that the social structures within these informal communities were not as liberal as supposed. An important mechanism used to establish social cohesion within the artist colonies was the ritualization of everyday life. Some of the artists in Grez left testimony about the daily routines in Grez, being clearly structured into periods of being together as an international group, alternating with periods being in, for example, national subgroups. The whole international group of artists in the hotel ate their meals together in the dining room, while the artistic work and the leisure activities between the meals took place in small groups or individually. After the common dinner, the Swedish artists Carl and Karin Larsson would invite the other Scandinavian artists to the studio for coffee. Later on, the whole international group would meet again for mutual evening activities, preferably music or dance evenings. From a sociological perspective, such routines are meaningful for the establishment of groups. Not only the individual groups from the same linguistic family needed to be consolidated, but also the whole group of foreign artists needed to define themselves as a group that stood apart from the French villagers. These well-structured routines of everyday life make clear that the international artists in Grez were eager to maintain a community. The previously described separation of the linguistic groups at the dining table might express a preference for casual conversation during the meal, but cannot be seen as representative for the international community in Grez as a whole. The dance floor seems to be a better metaphor for the polyglot life in Grez. The Swedish journalist Johan Christian Jansson, called Spada, wrote the following in an article that was published in a Stockholm newspaper in 1883. It would be unjust to leave Grez without even mentioning the word dance. There is pirouetting at least a couple of times a week. The ways are most diverse. The Swedes have theirs, the Americans totally different principles of moving their legs. And between them, further blended with French and other reminiscences, they have produced a lot of varieties. The Garea Dance is a peculiar dance. Waltzes and polkas are danced 7 different ways, and several dancers are developing the most cosmopolitan skills. The description of the mixed dance styles in Grez reflects how the different nationalities that were represented in Grez freely intermingled and became part of a transnational culture that did not stop at national borders. Going back to the earlier quoted passage by August Strindberg, it gets clear that this interpretation of the international community actually also corresponds to his quote, although it had been seen as evidence for the contrary. The last meaning is, in this way, an excellent harmony is maintained, sometimes finding warmer expression in a shared after-dinner dance. Also, the informal pictures, the ones that were not intended for publication, support this notion of an international community in Grez. The displayed picture shows a page from the sketchbook of the Swedish artist Nils Kröger from Grez in 1883. He caricatured a row of dancing Grez artists, whereas the Scandinavian and English-speaking artists alternate in a comical single file with heavy clogs on their feet. Besides, there are also photographs showing Swedish artists side by side with Anglophone artists in burlesque costumes at a masquerade in Grez. These photographs are a further hint that there was no national separation in the international artists community in Grez. Of course, the artists did not only party together, but the artistic exchange was an important reason for them to live in colonies with other artists. As they were studying at the art schools in Paris and going to the countryside during the summers, it was essential for them to get feedback from other artists, which also their memoirs and letters prove. Dialogues with other artists are described in letters, memoirs, and even published texts as valuable during the time in Grez. The question remains, if there actually were relationships between the artists and the international community in Grez, if they were on friendly terms, and if they also worked together or gave each other good advice in their work, how come that this internationality has not been raised until now? How come Swedish art historians throughout the 20th century thought that the grey-toned paintings from Grez were a naturalistic depiction of the local conditions, the humid air that derived from the river Loing, and not from the contemporary art in France? Several components were at work in the establishment of these aspects in the Swedish art history of Grez. A historiographical examination reveals that the conventional image of Grez in Sweden and the international interaction was first established by the artists themselves and consolidated by writers and art historians who were part of their circle in France. This establishing process began already in the 1880s, when the artists still were in Grez, and continued in diverse writings, and some of these artists were really prolific writers, until the 1920s, when some of the artists wrote autobiographies in which they nostalgically look back on the time in Grez. This nostalgic tone characterized also later writings on Grez, mostly because later texts were quoting and retelling the artist's own words. Of course, the written records of those who spent time in Grez are the only source material at hand. But comparing the depictions of everyday life in Grez in the published text with writings that were not intended for publication and that were written at the very time they were in Grez, an inconsistent picture emerges. While the published text raised the idea of an harmonious Scandinavian community in which the social and artistic interplay with the English-speaking artist was not made a subject of discussion, private records like letters and notebooks show that the Swedish artists happily kept company with the English-speaking artists as well. Unfortunately, the published recollections of the artists were not questioned by later art historians. In that way, the artists have unchallenged narrated their own art history and could thus include and exclude events and individuals at their own discretion. The question remains, why were these ideas of the colony in Grez established? For the scholarship on the colony in Grez, it has become an unfortunate fact that the golden age of the rural European artist colonies coincided with the nationalist aspirations of the 19th century. As artists during the late 1800s were, through the creation of national motifs and a national style, expected to contribute in the process of nation building, it became difficult for both artists and contemporary art historians to integrate the long periods of training abroad and the international exchange in the melting pots of the colonies into the national art history writing. In the Swedish art historiography of Grez, these problems were, for example, solved by emphasizing the Scandinavian community in France and by claiming Nordic traits in their works. But also the training through French teachers and with French role models had to be integrated, which is even more difficult as the painters in Grez became the most important artists during the period of Swedish national romanticism from the 1880s to the 1920s. In their own writings, artists like Richard Berg recapitulated how the Swedish painters, after their return from France, quote, put off their French gloves, end of quote, and started to paint what he called genuinely Swedish. Through depictions like this, they succeeded to claim credibility and thus their position as Swedish national painters. The first and maybe only aspect they abandoned immediately after their return to Sweden was the grey tone, which can be seen in the two displayed works that were painted in Sweden after the artists came back from France. There are obvious resemblances with their works from France, both concerning motif, compositionary structures, and not least the sentiment. But the grey overall tone has disappeared, and the paintings show a clearer light as well as a brighter color range. It is, however, doubtful whether this really happened because of the missing humidity from the valley of the Loing, and whether the experiences of the French training did not work in Swedish light conditions. I'd rather see a correlation with the negative criticism that the artists could receive in Sweden for the grey tone. The grey tone in their painting from Grez was clearly perceived as a French quality by Swedish art critics. Art critics in Sweden commented, for instance, the Swedish painter Julia Beck as not being able to let go the French grey tone, and that it actually was a pity, as she otherwise was a skilled painter. Julia Beck is one of the artists who earlier have been excluded from the Swedish art history about the Grez colony. She was utterly successful in France and received the honor of the Ordre national de la Légion d'honneur, but as she never returned to Sweden, but died in Vaucresson in 1935, and probably since she continued painting in what has been deemed a French style, she made her way into Swedish art history only recently. Grez has remained a place of myth in Sweden. In the general interest publications from the 1990s onwards, it gets obvious how the French village has become a Swedish lieu de mémoire, a realm of memory in the sense of Pierre Nora. The art history of Grez has in Sweden not been an abstract reasoning about events in the past, as it should be according to the field of historical sciences. Grez has in Sweden become a lieu de mémoire as its art history has been based on the nostalgic and emotional sense of the memories and paintings by the Swedish artists. The retold anecdotes about the masquerades and funny or romantic episodes from Grez contributed in that way substantially to the notion of Grez as the location of a Scandinavian painter paradise. In the late 1980s, the Hotel Chevillon in Grez was acquired by a Swedish foundation with the support of the Swedish king, as it was deemed a concern of national significance. In this way, it was possible to materially go into possession of the significant Swedish lieu de mémoire, despite its location on French ground. To sum up, the disregard of the international colony context, as well as the emphasis of the influence of local settings on the tonal expression of the paintings, which moreover were alleged to bear Scandinavian traits, are notions about the colony in Grez-sur-Loing that had been established in Swedish art history in the end of the 19th century by the artists themselves and contemporary writers and art historians who were on friendly terms with the artists. Apparently, these ideas have been constructed in order to establish a clear-cut picture of Swedish art and its history without any potential ambiguities. The Swedish art history writing on Grez can thus be seen as a solution for both the artists as well as the art historians in the late 19th century in order to integrate the long stays and the training in France, as well as the international contexts in which they worked and lived, into a national art history of Sweden. Merci.
Pour les francophones, parce que je vais faire la présentation en anglais, parce que c'est plus pratique quand on se comprend tous.
So that we all understand each other, I'm going to be speaking in English, but she needs to speak into the microphone.
About the exhibition and the excellent exhibition and catalogue, and Alexandra's presentation of the Scandinavian artists linked to Grez-sur-Loing during those legendary years up until 1886, when there was a large number of Scandinavians present in Grez. I will speak about those artists who either decided not to come to Grez at all, or about those who arrived a little later to Grez, or who decided to stay after that date of 1886. We will also see how Grez-sur-Loing was rarely their only encounter with artistic colonies in France. And we might even discover that these artists who came a bit later, they acquired what I call a third culture, were a bit different than those present in the 1870s and early 1880s in Grez. Either way, Questions about your own identity becomes more tangible when living abroad, and the national identity of the cosmopolitan Nordic artists that I will talk to you about was shaped through their international interactions during their stay in France, whether in Paris or in rural art colonies. So I have two computers here. Okay, so the traditional historiography, based on the nationalists' version of the events, has recycled a few images, among which you will find this particular image by Peter Severin Kreuer, the artist lunch at Grez-sur-Loing. It has become a sort of icon of the success of Scandinavians in France in the 1880s and has helped to disseminate the message that they lived in closed communities before returning home. However, we now know that the Nordic artists in Grez were quite closely linked to the artists of many other nationalities present in Grez at the same time, although not so much to French artists. Grez-sur-Loing in those early years was still quite a safe harbor to the Nordic artists. We all know that when you travel abroad in an organized charter trip, you can meet foreigners and you can speak other languages, but you don't really have to. Or you could also head abroad independently, and then you just have to mingle with the locals. So even though most of the artists involved went back and forth to Paris, Grez was for a while a micro-community within the wider circle of Scandinavian artists in France. Although in the 1890s, Nordic artists continued to participate in other regional communities as well as in Grez, there would never be another such concentration of Scandinavian artists within an artistic colony in France as there had been in Grez before 1886. This change is, of course, to me, a sign of an even better integration into the French art life. So, to prove my point, as my first image, I have chosen this rather small watercolor by the Swedish artist Anders Zorn. Now, I don't have any specific proof that he actually came to the Grez colony, although it is most probable. As you may know, he settled in France only in 1888, but he came regularly to Paris and France during the 1880s and was well aware of what happened in Grez, as so many of his friends spent time there. This picture represents his wife during a visit to the forest of Fontainebleau. It's actually called Emma in the Barbizon forest. It is possible that Zorn passed by to see the artist in Grez during that trip or another trip to this area, but in any case, we can be sure that he never stayed in Grez-sur-Loing for a long period. Zorn did, however, live in an artistic colony for a while, but that was in the village of St. Ives in Cornwall, England. That was where he worked on this canvas during the winter of 1887 to 1888, a painting that would give him his breakthrough at the Paris Salon the following spring. While in St. Ives, he would meet several other artists, such as the Norwegian painter Bernt Grönvold, the American Edward Simmons, and the couple Adrian Stokes and his wife Marianne Preindelsberger Stokes, who was, by the way, a very great friend of the Finnish artist Helen Scherfbeck. Of course, during that stay, he also met his Swedish colleague and friend from the Academy, Emma Löfstedt Chadwick. And Emma Löfstedt Chadwick is the perfect example of an artist working in rural artistic colonies. She married a friend of John Singer Sargent, the American painter Francis Brooks Chadwick, in 1882, and almost a decade later they would purchase one of the hotels in Grez, Le Pension Laurent. Löfstedt Chadwick came to France for the first time in 1879 and discovered first Normandy and the small village of Villerville. When she returned to France, she enrolled at the Académie Julian, where she became friends with Marie Bashkirtsev. She spent some time in Concarneau in Brittany, where she met Marianne Prendelberg and Hélène Scherfbeck. So when I do this presentation, don't misunderstand me for wanting to be a drop name of more or less famous artists. I only want you to notice that Löfstedt Chadwick, just as Anders Zorn and the other artists I will present to you today, were very well integrated into a wider and more international artistic circle, and maybe more so than some of the artists who stayed in Grez when it was predominantly a Scandinavian artistic colony. Although Emma Löfstedt Chadwick frequently traveled between Paris and Grez-sur-Loing, that she discovered already in the early 1880s, she only settled down there with her husband in 1891, after most of her compatriots had already left Grez for other places. You've already seen this image. So, of course, I have to mention again the Canadian painter William Blair Bruce and his Swedish wife, the sculptor, engraver, and watercolorist Carolina Benedicts Bruce. The Canadian artists decided to leave Barbizon for Grez-sur-Loing in 1885, where he met Carolina Benedicts. This couple, too, decided to settle in Grez-sur-Loing, but not until 1889, where they lived until 1894. Benedicts Bruce was also very well integrated into the French art scene. Here you can see how she represented her teacher, Alexandra Falguière, at work in his studio. She also made a bust of the French painter Édouard Danton that is in the Museum of Saint-Cloud, outside of Paris. And as you can see, she met Bei Kubota in Paris through their friend Seiki Kuroda, a Japanese artist working in Grez-sur-Loing. Just as the Chadwicks, this couple traveled a lot too. They went to Italy, Canada, Lapland in the far north of Sweden, etc. Despite this, it doesn't seem as they abandoned Grez-sur-Loing completely when they moved from there in 1894, as Carolina Benedicts Bruce would present watercolors from Grez later on too. At least she did so in 1897. The Kalstenius couple, another Swedish couple, Gottfried and Gerda, both of them painters, were friends of the Chadwicks and Benedicts Bruce, and they came to stay at the hostel of Madame Chevillon in Grez during the spring of 1892. Here you have Gottfried's young couple in love, painted in Grez, and next to it a portrait of his wife, probably made in their Paris studio in Montparnasse on the former Rue du Moulin du Beurre. Here are some images by Gerda Kalstenius too. And as you can see from the painting Late Summer in the Caboche field of Le Poldu, the couple also spent some time in Brittany in 1891, probably just after the departure of Paul Gauguin, who, as you know, was quite closely linked to the Nordic community through his Danish wife. Anselm Schultzberg came with a painter friend, Carl Tregord, to stay in Grez-sur-Loing in 1889. Here you can see Autumn Day by the River Loing and a snowscape from 1889. Schultzberg painted in many other areas too, such as Nogent-sur-Marne to the east of Paris, and also in Étaples in Normandy, where he was again accompanied by Carl Tregord. Unfortunately, I don't have any images by Carl Tregord, I think. So on the side here you have another view from the Fontainebleau forest, this time during summer, and the examples from Étaples. A little later, Alfred Haga, a young Norwegian artist portrayed here by Paul Cézanne in 1899, did not stay in Grez, but in the nearby village of Marlotte, where he had come on the advice of Christian Krug. Krug himself had stayed in Grez-sur-Loing in the early 1880s and was teaching at the Parisian Atelier Colarossi at the time. Maybe Krug planned the opportunity for Haga to run into his idol Cézanne in Marlotte. I believe also Borghild Arnesen, a female Norwegian artist, was there with her teacher Armand Point. Alfred Haga also socialized with Stuart Merrill and Oscar Wilde in Marlotte. And you can see one of Hauge's own paintings from this period. Then, of course, Julia Beck is closely linked to the colony of Grez-sur-Loing during the early 1880s, and she is never forgotten when the subject of Grez arises. Here she is portrayed by her French friend Richard Berg in 1882. And an example of her own work from the time she spent in Grez during those years, 1882 to 1885. In the end of the 1880s, after a short stay in Sweden, Julia Beck returned to France, where she lived in Vaucresson, near Versailles, and her style would evolve drastically. So, Julia Beck would live in Vaucresson for the rest of her life, even though this fact is often overlooked by the Swedish art history. While living and working in Vaucresson, she was actively participating in annual salons and other smaller exhibitions in Paris too. As an example, she took part also in Le Barque de Bouteville's exhibitions of Impressionist and Symbolist painters in the 1890s, alongside such artists as Maurice Denis, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and Suzanne Valadon. So even if she lived outside of the city, she was involved in the French art scene. In fact, when at home for a visit in 1894, she was interviewed for a Swedish magazine and said that although she thought life in Stockholm was pleasant, she found it impossible to work there in a serious manner, as she felt the city was not sufficiently lively. And as Alexandra already said, she would receive the Legion of Honor in 1934. She had to wait for a while, though, for her. And so there was a large number of Nordic artists who went to Brittany, so I wanted to show you some of those too. Just a few examples here. This painting, representing a scene of a burial wake, is probably painted in Pont-Aven by Swedish artist Gustav Theodor Wallin. It was bought by the French state, which is, of course, a great privilege, and is now in the collection of the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Quimper in Brittany. So, another artist who would search for inspiration in Brittany was Richard Hall, a very successful Finnish artist, Finnish, but had his education in Stockholm. And he traveled for a while yearly between New York, Argentina, and France. This scene from a school for girls in the Finistère was also bought by the state. And then I can't help but showing you this work from 1892 by the poor Swedish artist Per John Tage Evert, who tried his luck as an artist in France. Evert committed suicide just in time of the opening of the Salon of 1894, where this painting was presented. He probably never stayed in Grez. Instead, he went to Concarneau, a place that also attracted Paul Signac during this time. Although I have no proof if they met or not, the Swede was evidently influenced by the neo-impressionists' technique. These are two paintings by one of the so-called veterans among the Swedes in France, since Alfred Wahlberg arrived here as early as 1866 and lived in France until his death in 1906. He discovered many different parts of France. You can see here a landscape from Brittany, dated 1899. One of the first places he went to, however, was the artistic colony in La Creuse, quite a trip away from Paris and a little more complicated to reach than Grez-sur-Loing. Apparently, he was in La Creuse early on. Unfortunately, I don't really know exactly when the painting I have here on display was painted. It was wrongly dated 1857, but that can't be right. I would guess it's from the late 70s. The priest of Gargilles, the painting is from the village of Gargilles, Louis Imhoff, said in his memoirs that he met Alfred Wahlberg, but doesn't mention when, and he had one of his paintings in his art collection. And Wahlberg's experience in that region of La Creuse, often forgotten by the Nordic art historians, leads me to Allan Österlind, another Swede who would stay linked to France for his entire career. Österlind could be a textbook example of an artist's successful integration into his host country. He maintained a career in Paris, participating in exhibitions and salons, where he was, for example, a member of the Modern Society of Fine Arts, together with artists such as Lucien Lévy-Durmer and Fernand Knopf, among others. So here I just have two examples. I don't even know how to say this legend in English, the rat charmer, you know, the German story, Hamel. Anyway, so, and quite interestingly, same format of these cows. That is actually just from a private collection. There's a bigger one in Gothenburg that unfortunately I couldn't have a picture of. And so this is a portrait of Österlind, painted by his dear friend Ernst Josefsson, who's very, very famous in Swedish art history. Allan Österlind, of course, went to Barbizon upon arriving in France in 1879. Then he stayed briefly in Grez-sur-Loing a few times, and maybe a bit longer in 1885, although there is not much trace in his œuvre from those sojourns. Instead, Österlind chose two other regions of France that he went to for the rest of his life, Brittany and, of course, La Creuse. He discovered Brittany first, probably through his friend Armand Daillot, that he met in 1883. The idea to go to La Creuse may have come from his compatriot Wahlberg, or it might have been Armand Daillot's idea too, as Daillot was very close to the poet Maurice Rollinat, who lived there since 1883, and who would become a dear friend of Allan Österlind too, as you can judge by this portrait of the poet. According to the artist's son, Österlind was introduced to Claude Monet by Rollinat when Monet stayed in the region in 1889. So in 1886, Allan Österlind brought his friend Ernst Josefsson to La Creuse, and he would continue to stay with Österlind's family for 2 years, traveling also with Österlind to Brittany, where at first they went to Tréboul, and there, at Madame Laurenton's hostel, they met their friends Louise Brelot and Madeleine Zillard. The Swiss painter Brelot was very close to Österlind's family. She made this portrait of Ernst Josefsson that is in the National Museum of Stockholm. And then I will mention the Norwegian artist Christian Skredsvig, because he and his wife came to Lippå in La Creuse to visit Josefsson and Österlind in the winter of 1886 to 1887. Unfortunately, I don't have much information about this painting from his time in Lippå. And as you may know, Skredsvig had previously stayed in Grez-sur-Loing in the years 1881 and 1882. Erik Säv and Gustav. Oh, what is it? We need someone to press something. Quickly. 33 seconds. Well. I only have 3 more slides, but okay, so Erik Säv and Gustav Albert also went to the artistic colony of La Creuse around 1896 and 1897. There's no, il n'y a pas de télécommande? så det var därför det började se nervös ut. I only have 3 more slides. Oui. C'est que ça a été allumé trop longtemps. Il faut faire échapper et recommencer. Non, là c'est pas le bon. Voilà, ça. Là c'est bon. Voilà, je vais pouvoir conclure. Bon, so Erik Sev and Gustav Albert also went to the artistic colony of La Creuse around 1896 and 97. This was certainly on the invitation of Allan Österlind. Both of these artists would stay in France for their entire career. Erik Sev didn't live in France until 1890, and he never went to Grez-sur-Loing, unless maybe he did so for a shorter stay. I don't know. After 1900, he left Paris and chose another region to do his landscapes and work, Noisy-sur-Oise. And from 1897 and onwards, the other artist, Gustav Albert, lived in the region of Oise too. So despite living away from Paris, Albert participated yearly in the salons and had a patron in Jean-Baptiste Faure, the opera singer and art collector, who was also a friend and collector of Anders Zorn. Jean-Baptiste Faure would buy more than 30 paintings by Albert. So one last thing on, yes. So it was in Treboul in Brittany during the summer of 1886, so when he was together with Josefsson, that Österlind painted this very sunny scene of a baptism. It was bought by the Finnish art collector Dr. Antel, who often invested in art presented at the Paris Salon. You can also see the artist here standing next to the poet Edmond Haraucourt at the island of Bréa in Brittany, where Österlind worked a lot during his entire career. He did, however, relax from time to time also, as you can imagine, by the sign that he painted for his favorite drinking spot at Ile de Bréa, that he renamed the Cabaret of the Beheaded. And I have one last image here for you to prove that these artists stay their entire life. This is a very huge triptych that Österlind gave to his school in Stockholm. It was painted in 1909 in Brittany. So what I wanted to tell you about these expatriated artists is that unless they came from a wealthy background, they were obliged to keep up with the competitive art market in Paris. And by adopting what I call a third culture, neither recognized as wholly Scandinavian nor as French, Nordic artists in France met with greater commercial success, and their work was more easily accepted by French museum collections or international collectors. Without disavowing their own cultural heritage, Scandinavian artists of the 1890s were more successful in integrating themselves into their host country. And I believe this is visible also in the way they sought out different artistic colonies. Thank you.
Yes, we have some questions, perhaps. I will give you the microphone, if you need it.
Je vais poser la question en français.
I will ask the question in French. I'm surprised that in your presentations you don't show any paintings from Larsen. Larsen, who lived in Greece for 2 years. There's, in Grez for 2 years. And there's even a road with his name in Grez. We like Larsen very much in Grez, so that's why I'm asking this question.
Carl Larsson, it was very important for him to stay in Grez-sur-Loing, absolutely. And we have actually some pictures from the exhibition with his watercolors. So if we can change perhaps this one, if we can look at some of these. It's a bit later on, it's there. So here are some examples from the exhibition, some important watercolor paintings by Carl Larsson. And for instance, in the middle, the large watercolor, it's a loan from the National Museum and one of his most famous watercolors from Grez-sur-Loing. So, but it is, of course, absolutely correct that Carl Larsson was important in the Grez colony. Are there any more questions? Yes.
L'hôtel Chevion existe encore. Je trouve que c'est la bonne date de 10 heures.
Sorry, we cannot hear. Mrs. Axel talked about the writer who had written the article on Grez-sur-Loing, 1888, I think. 100 years after this date, another Swedish journalist went to see whether it still existed. And he inspired 3 Swedish to go and see whether it still existed. And they decided that it should remain the property of Sweden. And they started negotiating with the owner, the landlord, and they found a person, a rich person who could spend money for that, and a bank also helped to terminate this. And so we have Carl Larsson's workshop. You can go and live there if you're a composer, a writer, or an artist. It's a place where you can work calmly. You can go there, knock at the door, but they won't let you in because that's the place where we work. But it would be interesting to see what these people have done for 30 years at Grez-sur-Loing. It's very pretty, and there are a lot of artists and writers who've created some beautiful things, and it's really worth it not to forget them and to visit them along with the great painters we have today. Thank you.